Good evening. Welcome to this evening's event, Aung San Suu Kyi in a Time of Transition. I'm Alexandra Green. I'm the Henry Ginsberg Curator for Southeast Asia at the British Museum, and we're holding this event in connection with the Burma to Myanmar exhibition at the British Museum, which runs until the 11th of February. This evening's event is going to look at Aung San Suu Kyi in the changing political landscape of post-independence Myanmar, and I'm joined by three wonderful speakers, Wendy Law-Yone, Dr. Ma Thida, and Melissa Carlson. We are going to have Wendy speak first, and she is a Burmese-American critically acclaimed author. She was born in Mandalay in Myanmar, and she's just recently written a book, Aung San Suu Kyi, Politician, Prisoner, Parent, which came out in 2023. So welcome. Wendy, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Hilary, for allowing me to be part of this wonderful, once-in-a-lifetime exhibition as it comes to its close in the next couple of weeks. Hello, everyone. I'm honored to talk to you about one aspect of this very special exhibition, a mere fraction, in fact, of the 1,500 years of change from Burma to Myanmar. My focus will be on the period of transition that begins in 1989 and is still ongoing today. I've chosen this particular chunk of recent history, the past 36 years, for the simple reason that it begins with Burma's actual, that is to say, official name change to Myanmar. This period happens to coincide with the political lifespan of my subject, Aung San Suu Kyi. And if any one person has served as the symbol, the very catchword of transition throughout this time span, it is none other than Aung San Suu Kyi. So how did Aung San Suu Kyi become a national symbol at just about the time that Burma, as we then knew it, began morphing into what is now called Myanmar? To put it in mythological terms, one could say that as a national symbol, she sprang full-blown from the forehead of the only other national symbol in living memory, her father, General Aung San. It was Aung San who had negotiated independence for his country from British rule, only to be tragically assassinated on the eve of independence in 1948 at the age of 32. It was Aung San who had since reigned uncontested as hero, martyr, and founder of the modern Burmese nation. And it was Aung San, his spirit, his aura, his giant portrait, who presided over his daughter's debut on the political stage. This was her historic speech delivered on the grounds of the Shwedagon Pagoda in the summer of 1988. Aung San Suu Kyi was 2 years old when her father was assassinated. She had spent most of her life abroad, in India during her school days, and later at Oxford, first as an undergraduate, then as wife of an Oxford don and mother of 2 boys. Now, in 1988, she had come back to Burma to care for her sick mother when she found herself at the forefront of what was to become a massive popular uprising. 2 decades of totalitarian rule under a succession of inhumane and inept military dictators had brought the country to the brink of economic collapse. A spiral of peaceful demonstrations followed by bloody reprisals had begun. Persuaded by a group of protest leaders and dissidents to address the nation as the daughter of General Aung San, Suu Kyi delivered her maiden public speech on the sacred grounds of the Shwedagon Pagoda. This holiest of holy Buddhist sites, symbol of all symbols, was where her father had held forth as a young firebrand nationalist railing against British rule. And it was there that she invoked her father's memory, branding the people's uprising against the military as the second struggle for national independence. In the following months, Aung San Suu Kyi would make 1,000 speeches in public meetings and rallies all across the country. She would co-found the NLD, the National League for Democracy. She would become the moral and spiritual focus of the popular movement to restore democracy and human rights through non-violent civil disobedience. Suu Kyi's dramatic launch into political activism was meteoric, that is to say, short-lived. By September, the popular protests sweeping the country had cohered into a mass uprising and then a general strike, only to end in a blood-soaked crackdown. In the end, thousands were massacred and thousands more driven into hiding or permanent exile. Aung San Suu Kyi herself would spend most of the next 17 years in detention. By clipping her political wings, however, the generals in power had turned her into a brilliant bird of paradise in a sordid cage, into a symbol of self-sacrifice who would, quote, only fly for freedom, unquote, in the lyrics of U2's song, Walk On. For the authorities made it clear that she would be allowed to leave Myanmar and visit Michael Aris, her dying husband in England, but only if she risked never being let back in. Michael died in 1999, leaving her sons bereft of both parents. But still, their mother refused to leave Burma and risk being shut out of the country. I'm sorry, I think I might have that date. I might have miswritten that date, 1991. I think I mean 1991, sorry, that Michael died. It was a choice that shocked a great many at the time, especially in the West. But among her Burmese devotees, the decision was seen as the supreme sacrifice a mother can make of her own sons for the greater good of her country. Worshipful supporters referred to her as an angel, a saint, a female bodhisattva. For international rights groups championing her cause, she was simply the icon of democracy and human rights. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. By the time the generals released her from her longest stint under house arrest in 2010, Aung San Suu Kyi had been elevated in absentia to the status of mother of her nation. Cries of Aung Suu, Mother Suu, Mother Suu greeted her on that day, on the 13th of November, 2010, when the thousands upon thousands of people thronging the streets stampeded towards her front gate. The next 10 years would see a transition in Myanmar more dramatic and significant than any other to date. In fact, it would usher in a government that declared itself in transition to democracy. Democracy, that long-cherished pipe dream of the populace, was now the politically sanctioned catchword of the day. Reforms and amnesty followed, palpable and dramatic. Political prisoners were released by the hundreds. Labor laws were amended to allow unions and strikes. Press censorship was lifted, and freedom of speech rules relaxed. Revised currency and banking regulations made for overnight economic liberalization. As Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the NLD, rejoined the political process and were sworn into parliament, there was no denying that the new civilian head of the transitional government was herself in profound transition, from perpetual political prisoner to de facto head of state, in a power-sharing deal with her former captors, the ruling junta. And here was a truly perplexing thing. From her very first tussles with the military leaders And all through her serial detentions and reprieves, Suu Kyi never missed an opportunity to declare her devotion to the very institution that proclaimed her an enemy of the state. I have always been very fond of the military, she said in more than one interview. I have a rapport with the army. As a child, I was cared for by my father's soldiers. I was brought up to regard them as friends. Coming on the heels of a long stint under house arrest, such statements were met with understandable skepticism. What was behind them? Stockholm Syndrome? Sweet talk to disarm the enemy and dispel any intentions of retribution? No, it was love pure and simple, she insisted. Love unconditional. For as an advocate of nonviolence, she didn't believe in destroying people for what they had done in the past. She believed everyone had a right to redeem themselves. Here was a love destined to go unrequited. In entering into a pact with the junta, Suu Kyi was doing so, as everyone knew, with the cards firmly stacked in their favor. The military still controlled a quarter of all parliamentary seats, and any changes to the constitution required the votes of 3/4 of the legislators, plus one. They had rewritten their constitution in 2008, specifically to bar her from the presidency. So, when in 2016, the NLD managed to pass legislation creating a new post for Aung San Suu Kyi as state councillor, making her the de facto head of government, one of the generals with a seat in parliament accused the NLD of democratic bullying. Other legislators would describe Suu Kyi's governing style as democratic dictatorship, complaining that she and she alone made all the important decisions. Even senior government officials felt obliged to wait for her to weigh in on matters well within their areas of responsibility. The results were bottlenecks and backlogs that left urgent business unattended. But far more problematic to the world at large was Aung San Suu Kyi's decision to defend her government from charges of genocide committed against the Rohingya, the predominantly Muslim ethnic minority in the western state of Rakhine. The landmark lawsuit filed at the ICJ accused Myanmar of genocidal acts and other atrocities that had driven 750,000 Rohingya from their homes in Rakhine into neighboring Bangladesh, where they remained trapped in dire refugee settlements. If war crimes have been committed, was all Aung San Suu Kyi would concede, they will be prosecuted within our military justice system. Suu Kyi's willingness to take the stand at the ICJ hearings when she could have let the generals themselves take the heat. After all, it was their military operations that carried out the textbook case of ethnic cleansing, as the UN called it. This startling decision marked the final collapse of her international reputation. One by one, the honors and awards once showered upon the celebrated beacon of democracy and defender of human rights were stripped away and taken back. There were calls for her Nobel Peace Prize to be rescinded. Aung San Suu Kyi's appearance at the ICJ was seen by a great many in Myanmar as a patriot's mission to defend her nation's honor. When the hearings at The Hague began, thousands of citizens thronged the city hall square in Yangon, and thousands more flocked to other hubs across the country, all brandishing flags, banners, and placards supporting her. A year later, in November 2020, Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the NLD, won the national elections by a landslide. 2 months later, on the 1st of February 2021, the day the new government was scheduled to assume office, General Ma Thida declared his takeover of power in a coup d'etat. So much for the transition to democracy. Imprisoned along with other senior members of her government, Aung San Suu Kyi has since been sentenced to 33 years in prison for an assortment of charges. Unlike her previous incarcerations, however, prison this time bespeaks solitary confinement on a military base with none of the amenities of house arrest or even of Yangon's notorious insane jail. To date, there is no indication that Myanmar's preeminent political prisoner will ever be set free again. As for the innumerable resistance movements unleashed by the coup, the many armed and unarmed forces now pitting themselves with unprecedented ferocity and unity of purpose against the military government, the jury is still out as to when or whether they achieve critical mass. Among the new generation of Myanmar's freedom fighters are scores who saw the beginning of a transition government under the leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi. These sons and daughters of Ma Thida may have given up on her ability to deliver the promise of democracy, but they are not about to give up on the promise itself. The transition to democracy may have been derailed, but the country is still in transition. According to the Theravada Buddhist worldview, the child is forever indebted to the mother for her sacrifice of giving life, nourishment, and care in the womb and thereafter. Boys become monks for that fundamental reason, to repay their mother's metta, her loving kindness. They make merit on their mother's behalf to ensure a higher rebirth for her. Without sharing the same meritorious intention toward Ma Thida, the military regime has ensured for her a higher earthly stature, if not a higher rebirth, by elevating her from motherhood to martyrdom, from Mother Sue to Martyr Sue. Thank you. That's all from me, as they say at the BBC.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That was wonderful. And now I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Ma Thida, who is a Burmese human rights activist, surgeon, writer, and former prisoner of conscience. Since 2021, she's been the chair of the Writers in Prison Committee of PEN International, and she's a current fellow of the Writer in Exile program of PEN Germany. So Ma Thida, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be part of this panel. And first of all, I would like to say, I want to focus more on the period of transitions rather than Aung San Suu Kyi, because I ever believe the perspectives of seeing her as the only persons to represent the country, from the very beginning, it was not the right approach. So I always prefer to see the country not through her, but through the history. So yeah, my first slice, please. So it's a very obvious history. We were under the military regime since 1962, a little bit over 10 years after the independence. We were already under the very first coup and the socialist military regime for 26 years. And it's changed to the one-party political systems by its 1974 constitution. So her role in these days were not very obvious because she was not in the country. But I wrote a book called The Roadmap, And our starting point to decide we should be on the road to democracy from 1988. And then she was with us. So we having gone through in my book, The Roadmap, there are altogether 7 chapters. And by the end of the 2010, I always say we were at the fork in the road, you know. We were no more on the junction of the road to democracy. We were in the fork, at the fork in the road. So there will be so many ways, and a lot of people are having such a big concern about that. But at that time, because of the 2008 constitution, she was barred from running as a kind of the presidency. But we believe there will be some ways to proceed. So with the help of the international community, her decisions has changed in 2010. So for boycotting the 2010 election, it's been because of the 2008 constitution, very undemocratic. So she decided not to join the election. But the Thein Sein government after 2010 election, general election, making some impression to the international community, saying that we are moving on the road to democracy by this quasi-civilian machine, but it was actually not. We all know, a lot of people in Myanmar know, but after sometimes with a lot of pressure, she finally decided to join 2012 by-election. I think this was the very beginning of all the problem, you know. So as soon as the NLD joined the next slide, please, the by-election in 20th April 2012, NLD won almost 99.9%. Indeed, the one elected person has been barred for the qualification, something like that. So make me a little bit shortcut. So you can see within less than a month after NLD or Aung San Suu Kyi were joining the parliaments, there was the Rakhine incident on the 6th May 2012. So in politics, there is no coincidence. So Rakhine incidents making that Rakhine states under the state of emergency till 2016. That's me. Whatever happened in Rakhine states from 2012 to 2016 is directly under the control of Commander-in-Chief, not under the control of any civilian part of the government, you know. So in July 2012, the Thein Sein government makes some kind of the censorship relaxations. And to be frank, I have a big doubt, you know, the needs for the military to prove it's the savior of the country. It needs instability. Then it needs hatred. It needs hate speech. So to practice hate speech freely, we do need the relaxation of the censorship. So I cannot give you any evidence, but it sounded to me the censorship relaxations and the media law in 2012, mid of 2012, it has very different intention. So, of course, with the 2013 Freedom of Association law and so, but to be clear, in 2015, the Protection of Race and Religion Bill, it's very important. It's giving not just Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD, but also the whole society in very difficult situation to practice freedom of religion. It was approved by the parliament, run majority by the USDP, the military supporting political parties representatives. So my point is, were we on the road? Were we still at the fork in the road? I don't believe it. 2008 Constitution itself and beyond 2015, in this situation, we all were in a maze. We were no more on the road, you know. That's why whatever, NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi, whoever, believe in democracy, trying to march miles after miles, roads after roads, but we were not in anywhere beyond the maze. So the next slide, please. So after 2015, we need to think about so many facts, like Article 436 of the 2008 Constitution, to change the most important parts of the Constitution. Because of the Article 436, it was not allowed. And the Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD have been doing a lot to change the full article, this article, but it was no success. So it's pretty much the military itself is very obviously very patriarchal and the corrupted institution, but we cannot make any institutional change for military. And the religious figures and their intervention is also very obvious in these days, but it's also very directly related to the intervention by the military. Most of these religious figures are well supported by the military, not by the pure Buddhists. So that's another issue. And I also believe the 5 decades of the censorship, heavy propaganda, and very ineffective education, it's making us intellectual blindness. So with the Aung San Suu Kyi or NLD or any other who have intellectual strongness, we cannot easily combat the intellectual blind society. It's a very big challenge. So then the internet and social media platform, it's misinformation, disinformation, deliberately done by military, making us very difficult situation. So not just Aung San Suu Kyi, but the whole country is in the very problematic situation. But for the international community and international media, since our issue is so overwhelmingly complicated, they try to oversimplify and making the oversimplified narratives. That's also helping Aung San Suu Kyi as the only person to look at for the country. And it was very disturbing to me, because there are so many people and the general public, we are struggling. We don't accept these things, but we having overlooked, and the identity of the identity politics and the peace business has been going through from the very beginning of the Thein Sein government, but it was also being pretty much overlooked by so many incidences, and that making us in very difficult situation in this maze. So next slide, please. And in 2016, and because of the state consular law, and we can say, even though she cannot be the president, she lead the country, obviously. She have been the key persons to run the country. But this state consular law has been the brainchild of a very successful lawyer, U Ko Ni, and he was shot dead at the airport on 29 January 2017. So it was a plan, it was a very big challenge. So when we look at 2017 Rakhine incidents, you know, very detailed. I think the because of a lot of people still focus on the individual hero-ness or star-ness, something like that. The very detailed facts has been overlooked all these days. That's why I would like to mention about this. The August 9, the commander-in-chief, Ma Thida, the current coup leader, meeting with the leaders of the Arakan National Party, and in the media, they said for peace and development in Rakhine, but that's narratives of the military. But the ANP leader said the commander-in-chief made detailed explanation about the operation. What kind of operation? On August 9th. So he, the commander-in-chief, sent 2 people, 2 persons, who do high-ranking military officers to Aung San Suu Kyi, the state consular, on August 10th. And the request is to declare the states of emergency. So if someone's declared the state of emergency, it means it needs the decisions from the State Defense and the Security Council. Thank you for the slides. So then it also means none of the people from the government can intervene. All the operations and all the decisions will be under the direct control of the commander-in-chief. So that's why she denied, and she just says we can issue the curfew ordered, the 144. And at the same time, the military declare they have been deployed. The Ministry of Defense Facebook pages show the photo news of the 2 regiments with full equipment, Regiment 33 and 99, sent to Northern Rakhine 1 day earlier than the statements of the declaration issued by the government. So it's a very detailed fact, it's a true fact. And the problem is we have been very disappointed by her decisions to make a comment or any response very lately, only in 19 September 2017. She made a speech, not in Burmese, but in English. That means she just tried to convince the international community, but she has no enough I don't know, the guts or the willingness to talk to its own people on that day. You know, that's why we were pretty shocked to learn about what's going on in between, you know, what kind of pressure, what kind of the negotiation, all the details has been pretty much like, you know, both sides is using at that time, I just want to say both sides, not the perfect explanation, but it was very difficult for us to understand what's going on into the civilian part and the military part of the government. What happened? We never ever understood these things. So beyond that, next slide, please. There are a couple of other issues. It's all about the identity politics in 2019, 18, 19. So many struggles, you know, NLD tensions with the Karani for the Bojo statue, for Bojo Aung San statue in Kayah State, and some other incidents, especially with the non-Burma ethnic groups. So that's making, giving kind of the pretty much impression that NLD gains not full popular support from the public. So that's giving the commander-in-chief having more confidence about, you know, 2020 election and hoping that the military backup USDP party could win even without that. That's why on the 2020 August 17 and 34 political party has been meeting with him and saying that we support and we can make a coalition government if we can not, the USDP party couldn't win the majority with us. 34 political parties with our votes, we could make a coalition government and we could lead the country from 2020 beyond. That's making us the big alarm. That's why, even though not every single persons were happy with her and the NLD from 2015 to 2020, for the 2020 election, we all decided, okay, this is the biggest alarm. It's they're trying to keep the power illegally and illegitimately with their own boss overweights. So why not we use our weapons? This is the voting. That's why 2020 election results, it was no doubt that this very decisions from the people, you know. So I just want to make a quick, so next slide, please. So whatever, after the 1st February, it's trying to change the military, it's a very obvious that, a lot of the legal reforms into the undemocratic way by the SAC, the State's Administrative Council, run by the Commander-in-Chief. So it means that their concern is not just Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD, but also the people. That's why beyond the coup, they try to undermine the result of the election. They try to undermine whatever we have been going through during these last 5 years. So this is, I don't want to go through the detail. It's the timeline of the revolution from the 5th February, the Committee of the Representative of the the parliaments, and the National Unity Government. And after the very traumatic atrocities, people decided to take arms. So the People Defense Forces, so and so. And next slide, please. I just want to share this graph. It's how related the People's Nonviolence Movement in blue, it's underneath, the response of the military violence is in green, and the result of the casualties of the civilians are in red. So you can imagine how much the military's decisions, it's militaries deliberately make people as enemies for them. So next slide, please. I just want to mention a couple of the other atrocities. So in June 2022, they put her, Aung San Suu Kyi, in so many allegations, and without explanations, they moved from her to the courtrooms, to the prison venues. That's why after the 1988, that was the very first time for her to be in prison. She was only at the house arrest. So the seriousness and the bitterness, the anger and the hatred by the Commander-in-Chief against her was very obvious. That's why when we apply the idea, her good relationship with the military during the 2015 to 2020 was like misunderstanding might be, or the pretty much like our just unilateral thoughts. If they make a very good relationship, what kind of treatment she got back from the military and the Commander-in-Chief right now, because it's beyond any other actions throughout the history. So not just her, because the Phyo Ziyador here, the Jimmy and Phyo Ziyador, they were executed. They were arrested and they executed. They make them that sentence. Why? It's thought to be Phyo Ziyador is one of the Aung San Suu Kyi's favorite MPs. It's something like that. So they just don't make her the physical problem. They also mean to make her in the mental torture or the emotional difficulties through this kind of the atrocities. So the next slide, please. And they also, after the 2023, they extend the term again and again. After 6 months, they also dissolved the NLD in March. So the Commander-in-Chief and military, their intention is not to having any strong civilian political parties, whether it's led by anyone, Aung San Suu Kyi or not. Their aim is not having the strong civilian political parties. That's very obvious, So I don't want to make very long things, but they also a little bit, try to next slide, please. Yeah, it's a pretty much like so many data, making us my point is it's a very hard to understand how much the deeply rooted military intentions and atrocities and having gone through is not just hurting her, but also indeed the whole country, physically, structurally, emotionally, everything, intellectually. So yeah, we already in a maze. It was not the U-turn. We were never on the road to point B to democracy. We were still at the point A in the maze. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ma Thida. That was wonderful, very interesting. And now I'm delighted to be able to invite Melissa Carlson to speak. Melissa Carlson is affiliated with the University of California at Berkeley in the United States. She's a specialist in the development of Burmese modern art and national identity in the late 20th and early 21st centuries under authoritarianism, isolationism, and censorship. And she's contributed to the British Museum's current exhibition, Burma to Myanmar, and the accompanying book. So Melissa, please.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the panelists. It's a real honor to be here with everyone. So I'm just going to jump in here and start. So after over 120 years of British rule, so we're looking at from 1826 to 1948, and just over a decade of independence from 48 to 62, General Ne Win's coup d'etat and resulting policies of isolationism and censorship severed Burma's avant-garde artists who were accustomed to global cultural circuits and artistic exchanges. So tonight, I'm going to examine how artists interested in modern art practices proved resilient and demonstrated intense productivity and innovation across socialist Burma in subsequent decades. But most importantly, I'm going to demonstrate how avant-garde artists activated a unique political voice. I'm dividing my remarks into three sections. The first is a brief introduction to the environment from which the avant-garde emerged in socialist Burma. Then I'll review some of the paintings in the exhibition or my book chapter, and I'm going to situate the avant-garde as key figures of political resistance and critical voices in shaping national identity. And then finally, I'm going to analyze in depth Aung San Suu Kyi's self-portrait, who we see here. It's from 1974. It's also in the exhibition. And in doing all of this, I want to propose that avant-garde artists in Burma, long before Aung San Suu Kyi emerged, they've played an active and important role in shaping political culture. So I kind of want to shift away from this narrative that positions Aung San Suu Kyi always in opposition to the generals, and that's kind of this narrative that I think has continued since she's been present. So first, despite saying that, though, I would like to open with this image of Aung San Suu Kyi. And it was drawn in 2011 by the artist Kin Mong Yen at the start of the civil-military transition era. So that's 2011. And that's the period that stretched until the recent coup in 2021. And this is when the Thein Sein military government instigated a series of reforms that included partial civilian rule and steps towards a free market economy. And I'm starting with this image because I want to stress that it's the very act of creating it that was revolutionary at the time. This is a moment where we're at the end of a half century of censorship. And so it's not so much who is portrayed or what she stands for, but the very act of the artist creating it. After a half century producing artwork, and despite of the world's most stringent censorship regimes of the visual arts, here we have an artist testing the newfound boundaries of freedom of expression by drawing a previously prohibited subject, Aung San Suu Kyi. The drawing in and of itself is a revolutionary act. And I want to stress here again that the artists who I'll introduce in my presentation staged political protest on their canvases or in their performances long before she emerged onto the political scene. And again, artists today, those of whom who are creating art with social or political commentary, have also moved beyond protest framed around a narrative of Aung San Suu Kyi versus the military government. So with this in mind, let's start at the onset of socialist Burma in 1962, where we meet a bold, vocal, and politically engaged avant-garde. So before I discuss the artwork that they were producing, let's briefly understand the environment from which they emerged. What exactly were these artists rejecting in terms of artistic production? So when General Ne Win seized power on the 1st of March in 1962 in a coup d'etat, he initiated the Burmese way to socialism, incorporating elements of Marxism and Buddhism alongside nationalist policies. The impact on the arts and artists was immediate through the promulgation of the 1964 Library, Museum, and Exhibitions Monitoring Act, which outlined permissible content for art exhibitions and formed the basis for Burma's censorship policy for the visual arts. However, it omitted a formal legal framework, opening the door to arbitrary enforcement by government censors who had little interest or training in the visual arts. Socialist-era censors applied near-blanket restrictions on non-conventional forms of expression that they feared might be used by artists to mask criticism. So paintings deemed offensive or subversive were removed from exhibitions and sometimes even defaced. As a result of these restrictions on freedom of expression, a distinct type of artwork emerged. So with this lack of clear guidelines on permissible artwork, the state-run Burma Art and Sculpture Council, which held 2 exhibitions yearly, tended to favor paintings that they thought would pass scrutiny with the censors, the state censors. Therefore, they began to prefer canvases that depicted Buddhist festivals or acts of devotion, romanticized pre-colonial landscapes that highlighted agrarian scenes, and an increasingly conservative interpretation of Buddhist Burmese morals, such as discouraging nudity. In general, most acceptable paintings were in the realist style. However, facets of realism, such as Impressionism, also appeared alongside paintings called one-line drawings, or two-dimensional paintings in the style of Bagan temple murals, in which figures and landscapes are depicted with bold black outlines. But if you look here at this page from one of their exhibition brochures, the State Council, you see that they're absent of any portraits of General Ne Win or canvases that highlight his economic policies, or even canvases that laud workers, such as in the style of socialist realist artwork produced in the Soviet Union, China, or Vietnam. And this is a quite unique feature of artwork that emerged in the time period. And in the bottom left, you see a painting there of Baji by the artist U Baji. And you have a young girl extending her hand to help an ethnic Karenni minority climb a mountain. And this is quite emblematic of that type of artwork. And it's called Rising Kaya. And so here we have another one of U Baji's paintings, Candlelight Dance. And here a young woman in formal dress performs the oil lamp dance. And it's an act of Buddhist devotion. She's twisting to keep the brass plates of oil upright. The dancer is supple and submissive, not defiant, and her devotion could easily be supplanted to the state. So Baji established this baseline of realism, acceptable realism, that was deemed permissible by both the Burma Art and Sculpture Council and later state censors. But this type of realism produced images rooted in fantasy, mythology. They portrayed a Buddhist Burman culture that rarely, if ever, reflected lived conditions. And this is the type of visual language that the avant-garde co-opted to try to bring canvases back into conversation with their surroundings. For example, we have a painting here by Arthur Sun Myint, who painted his self-portrait nude from the waist up, wearing a pair of dark sunglasses. And he did this while looking into a mirror. He's using realism and the sepia tones of a photograph. So doing that, he achieved the right balance of content and form to circumvent repeated censorship of previous nude paintings that he had submitted to the council. And the title, Myself Not I, is based on the Buddhist idea that what you see on the surface is not reality. It's just an illusion of life. Perhaps he was alluding to the type of fantastical realism in the art favored by the state censors. And this painting, just an aside, was the first nude accepted into one of the state-run exhibitions. And I think it's one of the first paintings where the avant-garde is really tapping into this language, realism preferred by the state, to navigate censorship and to challenge notions of what can be depicted on canvas. And another brief point I want to make is how, under isolation, artists began to repurpose existing cultural currents that remained in country once the socialist government prevented new inflows of concurrent cultural material. For example, many artists transitioned into illustrating translations of foreign avant-garde literature and poetry, at which point they discovered figurative language, such as metaphors, personification, and similes. And this new form of writing liberated artist imagery and opened a new coded visual language, which permitted them to engage in political protest and social commentary, interacting with viewers and even censors. And just to give a quick example, here we have a painting by Kin Sui Win, Sleeping Lady from 1981. And her discovery of T.S. Eliot's poetry transformed her work. And this is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, if you are familiar with his poems, written in 1915, translated into Burmese in the 60s. Let us go then, you and I, with the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. So she took his metaphor in the third line and painted a woman floating on the night sky, in the night sky, to represent her own sense of missed opportunities and loss due to Ne Win's policies of isolationism. So you see, she intended it for a book cover, but censors banned it due to the implied nudity, but she still managed to engage in a type of protest against the government. Which brings us to kind of a step up from that in terms of the artists are getting a bit more aggressive. And here we have artists who are using this figurative language accessed through poetry and books to become a sort of an artist as witness or to document injustices. And so they began to use the allegory introduced in the new forms of writing and pair it with realism. And so in this instance, in 1986, San Min painted Express 2 to capture his dismay at the rampant corruption by the Ne Win government and the resulting inequality between those with and without military connections. His painting features a car painted in red with a silhouette typical of the 80s, thin bumpers, an anemic metal frame, a triangular silhouette. Yet the car, painted in the cleanest lines of realism, depicts a door handle but no visible outlines of a functioning door. In lieu of tires, he has tank treads running on a continuous track system. And according to San Min, a car such as this symbolized a luxury that only those with government jobs or connections to the military could afford or access. And to anyone driving such a car or to someone on the street standing and watching these cars go by, the division was clear about which side someone stood morally, politically, and ethically. And here's just a nice picture of San Min with his painting. But I want to give you a sense that we have here, just in that the period of the 60s, 70s, and 80s before Aung San Suu Kyi, a very politically engaged and active avant-garde art community. And so with this in mind, I'd like to end by taking a closer look at Ma Thida's self-portrait that we saw in my title slide. So first, though, I want to provide the social and political context during which he painted this self-portrait in 1974. And that's quite a pivotal year in Myanmar or Burma's history. 1974 was, he painted this amid a spike in government oppression that culminated in a brutal crackdown on student protest. The protests were associated with the death of UN Secretary General U Thant. And also in 1974, as I think Ma Thida mentioned, Ne Win's Revolutionary Council was disbanded by Ne Win, and he formed a new cabinet, ruling then from then onwards as the Burma Socialist Program Party. However, all original military members remained in leadership positions, and even more disconcerting, he consolidated his rule to a single party system with a new constitution, the 1974 Constitution. So on December 5, 1974, thousands of students, including probably Ma Thida and definitely San Min, who we saw on the previous slide, they gathered to protest Ne Win's refusal to grant a state funeral to the revered nationalist and diplomat U Thant. And keep in mind, he had served as a UN Secretary General for the previous decade, from 1961 to 1971. So he was held quite a position of prestige around the world. So as word spread of a lack of a state funeral for U Thant, and as his coffin progressed from the airport to a race course in the center of Rangoon, that was only accompanied by a procession of UN officials and the Australian ambassador, protesters eventually seized it after it made it to the race course, and then they seized it, I think, when it was departing. And they moved the coffin to Rangoon University, which was by then renamed as the Rangoon Arts and Sciences University. And so over the next week, the students would hold a series of ceremonies and protest events until police and the army eventually raided the campus with much brutality, and the government declared martial law. And it's at that point where many students, including San Min, would be sentenced to lengthy prison terms. San Min himself, for his role in the protest, spent 4 years in prison. So that same year, Ma Thida, around that time actually, submitted to the Wild Eye Modern Art Exhibition in Rangoon this very lifelike self-portrait of himself. We can see that he has long hair, kind of resting behind his shoulders, which was an indication of social radicalism and solidarity with student protesters. From this portrait, he's there on the right, looking at his artwork, but he's encircled the teak board with a metal chain that looped the image multiple times, almost around his neck, like he himself is enchained. And some of the chains are hanging loosely down. And you can't see it in his photograph, but he had topped it with a metal star, which was a symbol of the military. And for this exhibition, he submitted it as untitled to evade censorship, but they saw right through it. And the same day it opened, they returned it to him. I think actually they returned it to him after the exhibition closed. And when they did that, they had ripped the chains off, ripped the star off, but he was determined to engage the censors again. In 1976, 2 years later, he transformed the self-portrait into an installation and performance art piece, and he showed it using a different name, Hunters. There's no documentation or recording of his performance, but he took the teak board with his painting, wrapped it in leather, threaded ropes through the holes where the chains once hung, sat the painting on a deer's skull, embedded in the antlers, and for the performance dragged the entire piece around, presenting himself as captive prey and transforming his self-portrait into a commentary on surveillance and authoritarianism. But most importantly, you have an artist who is again and again refusing to be silenced and going up against the state. And here is just Ma Thida later in life. And he, as throughout the rest of his life, he actually continued to engage the portrait, and he brought it even to Hong Kong and recreated his 1976 performance, the first time he had been able to do it since his arrest. So I'm going to just end here, and I hope that my presentation on Burma's avant-garde art and artists contributes to a new understanding of post-colonial state authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, and one that incorporates artists and other creatives as shaping politics and national identity. So it's not just political figures, spiritual figures, political parties or institutions, and hopefully also threading these artists and artworks into a new, more inclusive global history of global modernism. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was very interesting. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. We have one question here, which is, how risky is it for Native artists residing abroad to use art for display in Myanmar? So I assume that's presumably from Melissa.
So if I'm understanding the question, it's how risky is it for a Burmese artist living abroad to exhibit artwork in Burma? Well, I mean, from the artists that I work with or were the focus of my research, I would say it's probably, it depends on the content of your artwork. And I think many of the artists that I work with who previously were kind of enjoying the last, kind of from 2011 to 2021 before the coup, there was a lot of more experimentation with subject matter and content and styles. They've all kind of retreated back to sort of pre-2011 concerns about censorship. So you have artists once again, acting with caution. So self-censorship, worried about societal censorship, state censorship. So I would personally, I think it depends on what you're painting, I would say.
Thank you. And another question is, which has been the most influential visual image of Aung San Suu Kyi? I don't know if either Wendy or Ma Thida has an opinion on that, or Melissa.
Influential in what way?
Excuse me. It doesn't say visual image.
I mean, Oh,
sorry, Melissa.
oh no, please, Wendy.
No, the thing that came to mind for me is not a painting, but a photograph. And I think one of the most powerful black and white photographs that's been published in many New York Times pieces and so on was by the photographer Melissa Carlson, and it shows Aung San Suu Kyi. It's in the middle of the crowd, and the whole crowd is in sort of very fast motion, so that you just see blurred images of them, but she herself is crystal clear. And I've always thought that that's one of the most telling, powerful pictures of her in recent times. But I'm not speaking about paintings or other representations.
Oh, yeah, no, I would actually,
sorry.
I would have to agree. I feel like when I think of visual imagery of Aung San Suu Kyi, I think of photographs. It's hard to pin. I mean, not to say that artists, especially after 2011, when there was sort of this uncapping, when censorship was lifted, you did have a lot of, everybody seemed to be painting portraits of Aung San Suu Kyi or her father, but none of those really stick into my mind as much as I think some of the more iconic photographs of her.
Apologies for my coughing. So another question is, what impact did the COVID-19 pandemic have on Myanmar? Did the pandemic add as a justification for the coup of 2021? Ma Thida, maybe, or?
Yeah, I don't think so, because we were, for the first and second wave of COVID, the NLD administrations has been doing pretty well, especially Aung San Suu Kyi herself becoming the messenger between the healthcare professionals and the people and the administrative staff. So we were pretty good in the shape. I might say the relationship between the people and the government was very public-private partnership to combat COVID was very good. For that reason, I think people believe in the civilian administrations a lot. So after the coup, there was third wave, and I couldn't say how many people having died because of the shortage of the oxygen supply, deliberate barring the vaccines. The priority for vaccinations is just for the military personnel. So all the treatment done during the 2022 July-August COVID wave was really terrible. At least 130 writer and the artist has been killed by COVID and the mishandling during the COVID by the military.
I think some of the most harrowing stories I heard about the pandemic times was that because the doctors and health workers were still on strike and forced to go underground to treat the sick and the wounded, the military had seized medical facilities and equipment, and the health system had pretty much collapsed along with the economy. And as the new wave of the pandemic raged the country, vaccination, testing, prevention, all these measures were stalled, and the death toll was skyrocketing, and people were literally gasping for air, but oxygen couldn't be had for love of money. And there were stories about military stockpiling oxygen tanks for their own army hospitals, which drove the cost of oxygen cylinders up to triple their original price. And I still remember the photos on social media showing people waiting in long queues for the bright blue and orange cylinders, which to me looked a lot like missiles. And of course, harrowing accounts of people rushing around the city in search of a cylinder to buy or top up, then rushing home with the one they've managed to secure, if they've been lucky, only to find that the family member in dire need has died. And then, of course, they rush back out to donate the cylinder to the nearest relative or friend in need. So pretty harrowing stories.
Wonderful. Well, I'm no, sorry, terrible. Wonderful. Thank you for the wonderful response, not wonderful COVID. I think we've run out of time. So I just wanted to thank Melissa and Wendy and Ma Thida for their super interesting talks. And thank you, of course, to the audience as well for joining us for this program. And so it's goodbye from the British Museum. Thank you for joining us. Please
Thank
do
you so
come to
much.
the exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.